But for today, we're not going to focus on the 1960s. We're actually going to talk about the civil rights movement, or what many define as the traditional or the short civil rights movement. This also relates to your extra credit assignment. Your source assignment this week is on Jacqueline Dowd Hall's article on the long civil rights movement, where she challenges the time parameters of the civil rights movement. She's one of the first to support this idea that the civil rights movement is much longer than traditional narratives would have you believe. And really in this class, we've been kind of supporting this long civil rights movement time parameters as we started our civil rights examination with late 19th century figures like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, concepts of gradualism, accommodationism, the talented 10th, and these sort of early figures who laid the foundation for the civil rights movement. We've checked back into the civil rights movement. We've talked about anti-lynching efforts in the 1930s. We've talked about political dynamics tied to civil rights. We talked about the Dixiecrat movement after the 1948 convention, desegregating the military, Democrats adding civil rights to their platform with Hubert Humphrey. We've talked about the sort of political shifts in supporting civil rights, the dangers for Democrats to support the civil rights agendas when the Solid South is really staunchly opposed to them. But today we're going to focus on this traditional, or what Jacqueline Dowd Hall would call the short civil rights movement. So I will give you guys a hint that this is a very important lecture as it pertains to your final essay. Hint, hint. Okay. So make sure you guys take good notes on this. You'll be set for your final essay. Any questions for me before we get started, guys? All right, great.
Thank you.
Great. Let's get into it. All right, guys. So you'll learn about the time parameters that Jacqueline Dowd Hall supports for the long civil rights movement. I can't get too much into that because that's one of the questions on your source assignment this week. But we'll start our examination with an event that many people consider the catalyst for the traditional civil rights movement. And you guys watched a documentary that touches on this last week on the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who went to a rural town in Mississippi called Money, Mississippi, to visit his uncle and some of his extended family. He didn't really understand the racial dynamics of the South, the dangers of challenging Southern racial dynamics. He made a comment to a white woman in a store, literally turned and said, "Bye, baby," to the white woman in the store, as he was sort of messing around with his cousins, and they basically dared him to talk to this white woman. Emmett Till went to an integrated school in Chicago, had white friends, didn't really understand the complexities and the very dangerous nature of racial hierarchies in the South. We've talked about this before, where these power hierarchies in the South are very much determined by your race and your gender, where white men are placed atop of these power hierarchies and see themselves as these sort of paternalist or these most prominent members of white society in the South. So by him challenging these power dynamics, he unfortunately was subjected to brutal mistreatment and horrible torture. He was murdered by the woman's husband and brother-in-law, who abducted Emmett Till from his Uncle Moe's right home in the middle of the night, beat him to death, shot him, tied him to an exhaust fan from a cotton gin, and threw him into the river. The two men were Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam. They faced charges on the crime, on the murder. They were acquitted of all charges, which is a very accurate representation or depiction, illustration of unfair treatment of African Americans in the legal system in the South. Both of the defendants were tried by a jury of all white individuals. The defense in the case literally brought up race in his closing arguments and challenged all of the upstanding white members of the jury to uphold their position in society and to make sure you acquit these good men of these allegations, blah, blah, blah. Really just shows you that court systems in the South were designed to promote and further this oppression and also to strengthen Jim Crow laws and to reinforce these power dynamics in the South. This had a lasting impact on the African American community. Emmett Till's picture was published on the front cover of Jet magazine, one of the most prominent African American magazines at the time. His face was brutally beaten until it was unrecognizable. His mother decided to have an open casket funeral in Chicago. National attention was paid to the funeral in Chicago, where it was a shocking sight for many of these African Americans, and also suburban white Americans to learn about the horrors that were taking place in the South. That many of these suburban, Western, and Northern white Americans didn't realize how drastic conditions were and how violent conditions were in the Jim Crow South. So it's important for raising awareness about the South. It's important for raising attention for these injustices carried out against Black against African Americans in the South, but also for exposing white Americans to these horrors that were going on in the South. Another major event that's considered a catalyst for the traditional civil rights movement is the Brown versus Board decision that is ruled on in May of 1954. This case comes about because a man named Oliver Brown in Kansas challenges the Topeka School Board that excluding his daughter from a white segregated school was a violation of the 14th Amendment. Remember, the 14th Amendment is very important in these a lot of these traditional civil rights cases, as it's supposed to protect all Americans under the provisions of the Constitution. It's called the Equal Protection Clause. We know that it was brought up and used in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, although it didn't work. And so a lot of civil rights activists, a lot of civil rights litigators, lawyers will use the 14th Amendment to challenge the constitutionality of these Jim Crow laws, whether that be desegregation or disenfranchisement. So there were several of these cases going on challenging the constitutionality of excluding African Americans from white schools, of segregating school systems on a state level. Remember, education is a state mandate, and so each state sets up their education system differently. So the NAACP gets word of this Oliver Brown case against the Topeka School Board, and they appoint Thurgood Marshall, who's the leader of the Legal Defense Fund, to put together several of these segregation cases into one larger class action or omnibus case that challenges the constitutionality of segregation in school systems. So this also reflects this sort of process of challenging segregation. Thurgood Marshall wins the decision. The Supreme Court rules that school segregation is inherently or breeds separation inherently. It challenges this notion of separate but equal. Remember, separate but equal is a precedent set in 1896 under the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. But what Thurgood Marshall and the LDF, the NAACP, argues is that the act of separation in itself breeds inherent inequality, right? That you can't separate people based on certain characteristics and say that those people are equal because the act of separation deems them unequal. So this idea, this whole concept of separate but equal, this precedent set through Plessy versus Ferguson is torn down. And this process of desegregating schools really begins after the Brown v. Board decision. Thurgood Marshall will be a very important, prominent litigator in challenging the constitutionality of Jim Crow laws. He'll challenge white primaries in the South. One very important one is here in Texas, the Smith versus Allwright case. There's actually a local African-American civil rights leader here in El Paso that challenged the constitutionality of white primaries, where African Americans couldn't participate in primary elections, so they could never get their candidates elected to the general election. His name is Lawrence Nixon. He's a very prominent civil rights leader or figure who challenged white primaries in the 1940s and 50s. Anyway, so this begins the process of challenging school segregation and integrating schools across the country. This will be a slow process. As remember, states are really in charge of how they allocate funds for schooling and how they provide public education for their pupils, for their children. So community or states take different approaches to try to combat integration, to try to stop integration. You looked at a few of those. Actually, I don't think those were part of last week's documentary, but we'll see several different examples. The Little Rock Nine is the first case of where the Brown v. Board decision is actually put into effect. In Little Rock, Arkansas, where 9 students are chosen to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They choose the 9 best African-American students they can find. They try to find examples of really good, upstanding African-American students to try to help ease this process of integration. Unfortunately, they're met with incredible resistance. They're met with violence at school. They are continuously harassed by their classmates and by their classmates' parents, to the point where Eisenhower, who's president at the time in 57, actually has to send in paratroopers in the fall of 57 to help force the school to integrate and allow these students to continue at Little Rock High. This is an interesting example of how politics come into play when trying to enforce these national mandates, right? The Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to segregate based on race. Well, Eisenhower's a Republican who in the 1950s doesn't have to worry about upsetting traditional Democrats in the South to get reelected. So Eisenhower is willing to be a bit more forceful in this process of demanding that these Southern states integrate their school systems. Another example that happens 6 years later in 1963 surrounds James Meredith and his admittance into the University of Mississippi. Now in 63, as you'll read in this chapter, in 60, JFK wins the presidency, and JFK has to sort of walk this tightrope between not pissing off these Southern Democrats, traditional Southern Democrats that many are still holding on to the party, even though a lot have left by the 1960s to join the Republican Party. So he's much more hesitant to use his power to enforce integration. Instead, he engages in these sort of backdoor, these sort of behind the scenes negotiations with the governor of Mississippi, a man named Ross Barnett, who's a horrible racist, who's a segregationist at heart, and runs on this platform of segregation. So you have an interesting sort of give and take between state politicians, Southern state governors, and Southern state political leaders who use the issue of segregation and integration as political capital for their own benefit, literally run on the platform of, as I'm a segregationist, vote for me and I'll hold off the federal government's integration of Southern society, and the federal government trying to implement these new mandates set by the Supreme Court that have deemed segregation in public schools unconstitutional. So it's an interesting play between national politicians, state politicians, the sort of national public sentiment, national public opinion. Often public opinion needs to change before actual legislation can take hold, where actual political change can take hold. And this is very much seen in the process of integrating school systems. James Meredith is eventually integrated as well, or is eventually admitted into Ole Miss University. But this is after several riots. Violence breaks out in Mississippi. African American journalists are murdered during one of these riots. And again, each time one of these events happens, the national media is very much reporting on it and disseminating these environments in the South and exposing Americans to these horrific conditions for African Americans in the South. So we start to see this process after 54, where more and more of these events are being reported on, exposing more and more Americans to these horrible injustices and changing public opinion about a state's authority to impose these horrific Jim Crow restrictions on one group of people, African Americans. So as public sentiment starts to change throughout the 1950s, really not so much until the 1960s, opposition to these civil rights actions becomes more and more violent and aggressive. More and more Americans are exposed to the violent nature of civil rights in the South. More and more Americans start to support large-scale national legislation to benefit the civil rights movement, and change starts to slowly occur. All right, so we talked about school integration. That's a very important aspect of the traditional civil rights movement. And really the goals of the traditional civil rights movement are to combat Jim Crow laws that are predicated on segregation and disenfranchising African Americans, and also against school segregation and specifically integrating Blacks into society, into economic systems, into political systems, and giving them more agency in the South. So those are the two sort of big goals of the traditional civil rights movement. And they're both reflected in the major accomplishments of the traditional civil rights movement that we'll talk about here in a second, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. All right, so the initial civil rights, or the initial traditional civil rights movement, is very much rooted in the church, right? You also watched in the documentary the section on the Montgomery bus boycotts that were inspired by the Rosa Parks story. You learned about the impact of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which is one of the first traditional civil rights organizations that focuses on civil rights agendas while also being rooted in Southern Protestantism, rooted in the Black church. To that effect, several of the early prominent members of the traditional civil rights movement are Black pastors and ministers, right? You learned about Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth, and certainly the most prominent or most important is Dr. Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King is a Presbyterian minister, and is invited to be the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association when he's only 26 years old. He's an incredibly eloquent speaker. He's an incredible leader of individuals. They see his talent early on and invite him to be the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association because they know he's going to hold a prominent role in the traditional civil rights movement. You also learned about E.D. Nixon. He's very important in working with Rosa Parks, bringing in the NAACP to use Rosa Parks and her events as a way to illuminate or illustrate the unconstitutional nature of segregation, right? Rosa Parks isn't the first to challenge bus segregation or transportation segregation. You remember Homer Plessy all the way back in the 19th century was challenging the constitutionality of segregation. Tallahassee had been through a bus boycott in Florida. So there's several other examples. But they realized that they can use Rosa Parks to illustrate how unfair or illustrate the oppressive nature of segregation because of her position as sort of a matronly woman who's just trying to get to work, so on and so forth. They bring in the WPC, which is the Women's Political Council. They know that they need to appeal to women who are also a very marginalized society in the South in the 1950s and 1960s, who began cooperating with African American churches to promote this bus boycott. And it brings national attention to the issue of transportation segregation in the South. Finally, in June of '56, the federal court rules that bus segregation is indeed a violation of the 14th Amendment. And finally, Montgomery buses start to integrate in December of '56. In an ironic twist, this is really, in many ways, about the sort of logistics of economics in Montgomery. White store owners wanted African Americans to ride the bus so that they could go downtown and buy Christmas presents. So as it approached the second Christmas of the boycott, it was really in the best interest of white business owners, even if they happen to be segregationists, to end the bus boycott. But again, this is another example of bringing national attention to the conditions or to the issue of Jim Crow oppression in the South. Okay, the desegregation movement after the Montgomery bus boycott shifts its attention away from transportation integration briefly, as it starts to look at integrating public spaces and public accommodations. In 1960, February of 1960, the famous Greensboro Four in Greensboro, North Carolina, challenge segregation in a Woolworth's department store. Four men, college students from North Carolina A&T, get together and decide to practice a nonviolent form of protest known as a sit-in. So not only was the early traditional civil rights movement rooted in the church, it was very much inspired by the nonviolent, passive resistance protests of Mahatma Gandhi. MLK's biggest influence in this approach to passive resistance was Mahatma Gandhi, who was opposing the British imperial rule of India, and uses tactics of love, of solidarity, of boycotts and sit-ins and public demonstrations without any violence to try to promote the agendas and goals of the traditional civil rights movement. So four individuals, Aziel Blair, David Richmond, Franklin McLean, and Joseph McNeil, college-age African Americans, begin to sit in this Woolworth's department store cafeteria. Basically, department stores used to have eateries in the bottom of them where you would shop all day and then you'd eat in their cafeteria. This was a national chain that segregated their cafeterias, segregated their restaurant spaces. So they sat at the lunch counter of Woolworths day after day, even though they knew that they wouldn't be served. This was a way to protest the oppressive nature of these segregation laws or segregation rules. They sat there from the time they opened until the time they closed. And they knew that not only were they drawing attention to the movement, but they were hurting in a small way the bottom line of the Woolworths department store. This was 4 seats that couldn't be taken up by paying patrons, by people who would come in and actually pay and eat because their service was refused. We also see an interesting relationship form between these 4 individuals and a man named Ralph Johns, who was a local white business owner who had influence with local media. He actually convinced local TV stations to come down and report on the sit-in. And this inspired more and more African Americans to come in and participate in this sit-in. By February 5th, the end of the first week, they had over 300 African American college students participating in this sit-in. Also, the TV cameras were exposing the mistreatment of these college students. Angry white segregationists were coming in and inflicting physical violence on these individuals, which was being filmed and then exposed the violent nature of segregationists again to whites across the country who didn't understand how horrible the violence was in the South. Eventually, Woolworths doesn't like all the negative publicity that they're getting, basically. And by the summer of 1960, they begin to quietly integrate um, their lunch counters. But this is more important for the impact that it had on the entire nation than just specifically integrating lunch counters at Woolworths department stores. What was most significant is that this inspired a new generation of civil rights activists, right? Out of this, you start to have a new voice in the civil rights movement. Rather than just being rooted in the church, very much supporting a nonviolent, but also a religious sort of foundation to the traditional civil rights movement, you now have a new, younger voice promoting their own agenda in the civil rights movement. Many of these African Americans are college age students who have a much more militant view of the civil rights movement. Many of them challenge the idea of passive resistance or the idea of a nonviolent movement. You're going to start to see a division in the 1960s between Black militants and these traditional nonviolent civil rights leaders. Out of this, you get the SNCC, right? These Southern groups like the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, the NAACP, Montgomery Improvement Association, they start to see that these African American students can have a major impact in bringing the next generation of activists into the movement. So it's actually Ella Baker, a leader of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who starts to promote organizing a college level civil rights organization. And it will become known as the SNCC. It's often referred to as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So their first meeting is founded in North Carolina, where the Greensboro sit-ins have taken place. They're sort of moving on the momentum of the Greensboro sit-ins, how much national attention that they got. And they actually ask Ella Baker to be one of the board members of the SNCC. And she says, no, I'm an older woman. This should be an organization for students with an agenda specifically geared towards students. A couple of important civil rights leaders go on to lead the SNCC throughout the first 5 years of the 1960s, James Foreman and Bob Moses. They'll be very prominent in organizing freedom rides, which challenges interstate transportation. We'll talk about those here in just a second. They're involved in organizing the Freedom Summer in 1964, which brings about the tragic Mississippi burning episode. And so they're very much at the forefront of these new, more active civil rights events through the beginning of the 1960s. And then after 65, 66, SNCC becomes increasingly radical. In 66, they elect a man named Stokely Carmichael to be the new president of the SNCC. After voter registration drives in Mississippi, he's popularized the term Black Power, which after 66 will really sort of separate itself from the traditional civil rights movement and will have parallel racial movements, the Black Power movement, which largely moves to the West Coast with the Black Panthers and much more Black militancy. And the traditional civil rights movement will continue through the end of the 1960s as well. All right, so the next big event is the Freedom Rides in the summer of 61, where the SNCC and the NAACP organized for a group of activists to ride interstate transportation, ride buses throughout the South, challenging the constitutionality of segregation in bus depots and on interstate travel in general. So 17, I believe, no, I'm sorry, 7 African Americans and 6 white civil rights activists board buses in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 61, and they travel through every southern state. As they arrive in a state, the black activists go into the white section of the bus depot, sit in at the bus counters in the white section, while the white activists go into the black segregated areas as a way to challenge the segregation system. Congress of Racial Equality, CORE is another organization that's very much involved in this. And as they get deeper and deeper into the South, they encounter more and more violence. The first major violent attack takes place in Anniston, Alabama, or actually they're attacked in Rock Hill, South Carolina first. This is also a good example of state authorities as they're pressured to either support these civil rights activists, these freedom riders, or to support these antiquated segregation systems. So based on the state and basically the leaders of that state, the governors of that state, you see some support the civil rights activists, give them police escorts. But as we get further and further into the Deep South, they resist, they remove any police presence, they try to resist any federal authority to protect these riders, and you see more and more violent acts occur against these riders. Again, these violent acts are being depicted on news media, and every night white Americans are watching the news, and these, white supremacists in the South attacking Black and white children, which is a very horrific and eye-opening event for a lot of whites across the country. This is also where the country is introduced to a real piece of shit named Bull Connor, who was he's the commissioner of public safety, I believe, in Alabama. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, he's the commissioner of public safety. When buses come into Alabama, he refuses to provide any police assistance to these buses. This leads to the attack in Anniston, Alabama, where 200 white supremacists throw Molotov cocktails onto the bus, burning the bus down, forcing the Black and white freedom riders off the back of the bus, where they're beaten with lead pipes, and one is put into a coma. Even a federal marshal who is trying to protect the riders is knocked unconscious with a lead pipe. And so these mobs are becoming increasingly violent, and depictions of these mobs are becoming increasingly frequent in national news media. All right, finally, this does inspire change. By the end of the summer of 61, the ICC, which we haven't talked about in a while, but is still in existence, the Interstate Commerce Commission, finally issues regulations prohibiting segregation in bus and train terminals across the country. All right. So as I said, as the 1960s progress, these civil rights groups, organizations, organize more and more public displays or public oppositions to these Jim Crow laws in the South. They start to realize the power of the national media and also the power of the international media. One very important event in understanding the power of international media and narratives in international media was the Birmingham Campaign of 1963. So Martin Luther King, the SNCC, the Congress of Racial Equality, the NAACP, several organizations focus on Birmingham as a place to challenge the constitutionality of segregation in public accommodations, right? Public parks, water fountains, restrooms, movie theaters, restaurants, public buildings, etc. So they choose Montgomery, Alabama. And in the spring of 1963, several of these civil rights activists come into Birmingham, Alabama, which is widely considered one of the most violent places in the Deep South pertaining to sort of these racial dynamics. So they're going to launch sit-ins. They're going to sit in front of City Hall. They're going to use these same non-violent, non-militant tactics to challenge the constitutionality or legality of these segregation laws. When they get there, they realize that a lot of the older African-American community has been so entrenched in these Jim Crow conditions that it's difficult for them to find enough African Americans, adults, to participate in these sit-ins and these movements. So what ends up happening is the majority of protesters end up being high school aged civil rights activists, African American students, African American kids. Well, Bull Connor, who we know is the Commissioner of Public Safety, has really put himself in a position of immense power in Alabama. This is through the use of fear mongering and fear tactics, saying that, oh, these northern agitators are coming down to disrupt public peace in the South, that these NAACP activists are the real sort of, terrorists, that they are the ones trying to incite violence against these really oppressive authorities in the South that are instituting these horrific conditions for African Americans. So they try to change the narrative, right? This is a very common tactic. You say, oh, they're really the bad guys. They're coming down here, and everybody down here is happy. Blacks like their life down here. If it wasn't for these agitators from the North, we wouldn't have any problems. So based on this fear mongering, he's gained more and more power throughout the 1960s. By 1963, he has allocated public funds to basically create an anti-civil rights army in Alabama. He even buys himself a tank, which he drives around Birmingham to try to threaten these civil rights activists. Well, now you have a group of hundreds of civil rights activists who are largely high school and college age individuals. Bull Connor says, sick the dogs, send the German Shepherds into this downtown square, turn fire hoses on these individuals to try to break up this peaceful protests. So this, again, has the opposite effect of what these racist, these bigoted white supremacists in the South really wanted. They wanted to threaten these African Americans, to force them to leave, and force them to stop trying to combat Jim Crow. In reality, what happens is the national and international news media starts to get pictures of 14-year-old girls being attacked by German Shepherds, of 13-year-old boys having their clothes ripped off by fire hoses. The pressure of these fire hoses was enough to take the bark off of trees, and they're turning them on, 12 to 16-year-old kids. So this horrifies the country. Not only that, but we're in the midst of a international conflict as we're in the middle of the Cold War. Well, our enemies during the Cold War, the Soviets, start to take this information and use it towards their own narrative. And they start to publish things that say, well, look, if this is the land of democracy and the home of, access to democracy and freedom, then why do they treat their own people this way? They use it to besmirch America and say, if capitalism and democracy are the freest forms of politics and economies in the world, then why is this democratic nation, the United States, so oppressive to their African American youth? And so politicians on a national level start to see that this is hurting our reputation in a larger geopolitical spectrum in context or in regards to our position in the Cold War. So again, the media is very influential in convincing Americans that it's time to change conditions in the South. Unfortunately, the white supremacists respond to these activisms by bombing several prominent African-American cultural centers, most notably the 16th Street Baptist Church, which kills several young girls as they tried to bomb, or as they bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, which was a very prominent gathering place for civil rights activists. So public awareness of the civil rights movement is growing. Change in public opinion is becoming more and more prominent, especially in areas outside of the Deep South. Then in the summer of 1963, we have the largest civil rights protest of the traditional civil rights movement, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So this is very much about access to economic agency, African Americans participating on fair or competing in fair marketplaces for jobs. But it's also about the Civil Rights Act of '63 that JFK was really too scared to present to Congress. Again, JFK, a Democrat, was scared about losing re-election in 1964, although we know that he gets assassinated in 1963. And so he's very hesitant to promote the civil rights agenda because he doesn't want to alienate traditional Southern Democrats. So this march is organized, and it has several different agendas. One, it wants to bring together these groups within the civil rights movement who have started to conflict with each other based on their approach to achieving civil rights. On the one side, you have the SCLC, you have the SCLC, the NAACP, Congress of Racial Equality, these more traditional, nonviolent civil rights organizations. Then on the other side, you have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, this burgeoning sort of Black Power movement, something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. We'll talk about that when we get to the voter registration drives in '64. So civil rights leaders wanted to bring all of these groups together towards one concerted agenda, right? To end segregation and to achieve full enfranchisement for African Americans. So we see that this is also a way to push JFK to push to finally promote the Civil Rights Act of '63, which he co-authored, to Congress to try to enact change on a federal level. So we see that a lot of important prominent figures are involved in organizing this movement. A. Philip Randolph sort of represents this older guard of traditional civil rights figures. Baird Rustin is an important activist. He's an incredibly interesting civil rights activist. He's marginalized on several fronts. He's an African-American man, but he's also a homosexual. So he's one of the first to try to sort of break down the oppressive conditions for gay men as well. Of course, it culminates with MLK's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. It's pulled off without any violence, without any conflict whatsoever. They're expecting, I believe, or they're hoping for 20,000 people to show up, and eventually close to 250,000 participants descend on Washington, D.C. And again, this is shocking to a lot of Americans who realize the extent of this civil rights movement, that it's, there's millions of people involved in this. This has international geopolitical implications, that this isn't just a small problem happening in rural areas in the South, right? That this is a systemic problem that needs large scale efforts to combat and challenge, and needs national legislation to protect African Americans in the South. All right, then in '64, another major event to try to promote African American enfranchisement takes place with the Freedom Summer, the Mississippi Summer Project, as it's often called. This is another reflection of student volunteers of the sort of youth movement within the traditional civil rights movement. We have 900 student activists volunteer for this Freedom Summer project, which is really a voter registration drive in rural areas of the Deep South. So the SNCC and CORE again cooperate and send 600 students to Mississippi, because Mississippi has been the most effective state in oppressing Black voter participation. In 1962, less than 7% of African Americans were registered to vote in Mississippi. This is because of the effectiveness of poll taxes and grandfather clauses and literacy tests and violence at the polling places and all of these Jim Crow tactics to try to strip African Americans of their enfranchisement, their right to vote, have been most effective in in Mississippi. So you have this group of students go down and go house to house, literally educating rural African Americans about their right to vote, how to register to vote, how to participate in the political process. Unfortunately, only one day after the first 300 volunteers arrive, 4 of the volunteers go missing. Michael Schwarmer, Andrew Goodman, I'm sorry, 3, and James Chaney, 2 white activists and 1 African-American activist, go missing. The country starts to pay attention to these efforts as day after day goes by, and the FBI and local authorities have not investigated these disappearances. The NAACP becomes involved. They send down their own investigators. Finally, the FBI starts investigating this issue by that fall of 64. And finally, 6 weeks later, they find the mutilated bodies of these 3 college students who were trying to promote or trying to get African Americans to register to vote, buried underneath the house of a Baptist minister named Edgar Ray Cullen. So this basically was an instance where local police authorities abducted under the guise of arresting these individuals. They arrested them, they put them in prison, they called the local chapter of the KKK. They said, we're going to release these 3 from prison at X time tonight. Be waiting for them outside of the jail. As soon as they released them, the KKK abducted them, murdered all 3 of them, and buried them under the house of Edgar Cullen. So they chose, or Cullen offered his property because he knew that he was such a prominent member of the society, of the culture down there, that they would never check his property. It was called Old Jolly Farm. So they end up trying, the FBI tries 7 other KKK members. They do convict several. Nobody serves more than, I think, 6 years in prison for these events. They find the bodies buried deep underneath a barn on this farm. Cullen himself is acquitted, lies and says he didn't know about it. He's actually reinvestigated in 2005, and he's put in prison for 60 years for manslaughter. So this gets a lot of national attention. Unfortunately, one reason it gets so much national attention is 2 of the activists were white, right? So this is hitting home for suburban Americans who think, I just sent my kid to college at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. He's becoming more and more involved in the civil rights movement. He could have been, or she could have been, one of the volunteers to go to the South and go on these voter drives. So this is starting to hit home for more and more Americans who realize how dangerous conditions are in the South, not only for African Americans, but now white Americans who oppose the Jim Crow South. And so it influences LBJ, who's now president after JFK is assassinated in November of 63, to push the Civil Rights Act of 63, which is now the Civil Rights Act of 64, through Congress. And he actually uses the martyrdom of JFK to help promote getting this bill passed. You know, this was the bill of the great JFK, who's just been assassinated. This will add to his legacy. We need to get this bill passed. LBJ's a Texan. He doesn't really operate within the political system the same way JFK does. LBJ's not worried about pissing off Southern Democrats. He's very much a sort of an egotist who has the audacity to push his agenda through no matter what. He gets the bill passed through the House in February of 64. It arrives on the Senate floor in February 26th of 64, and Republicans who oppose the bill launch the longest filibuster in the history of the US Senate, aided by these traditional Dixiecrats who have left the Democratic Party over Democrats adopting civil rights legislation or adopting a civil rights platform. So it's a 60-day filibuster where they literally stand up and read out of the phone book. A filibuster is basically if somebody holds the floor of the Senate, then you can't vote on any bills. So if you filibuster, you take up time by standing in front of the Senate, talking nonsense, telling people about your summer, reading the phone book, to take up time so that matters cannot be voted on. And this goes on for 60 days. All the while, Johnson is working behind the scenes to bring in Republicans and Democrats to work together to pass this bill. Hubert Humphrey is very involved. He's a Democrat from Minnesota who later goes on to be vice president. They bring in the minority leader, Everett Dirksen, a Republican who's willing to cross the aisle. He's very important in bringing other Republicans in to support the bill. And finally, by July, LBJ signs the bill into law with MLK standing right behind him. JFK understands the importance of these photo opportunities. Every time he signs a civil rights bill into legislation, he has MLK and prominent African Americans surrounding him so he can tie himself to the civil rights movement, which helps him get reelected in 64. He runs against a racist named Barry Goldwater who wants to resegregate the South. The Goldwaters have a political legacy of racism in Arizona that continues to this day, unfortunately. Okay, so while they're getting the Civil Rights Act of 64 passed, they know in order to get the bill passed, they need to take out specific language that protects African American enfranchisement. So the Civil Rights Bill goes on to be sort of a half bill, where it focuses on segregation and the unconstitutionality of segregation, ending segregation in transportation, education, public accommodations, etc. So that's sort of half of the goal of the traditional civil rights movement. After July of 64, the movement shifts its focus to establishing enfranchisement, to protecting African American voters. The most important event in this is the Selma March, which has gained a lot of national attention lately. Very prominent figures, MLK, John Lewis, Stokely Carmichael are involved in this march, where they march from Montgomery to Selma, from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, registering African Americans to vote along the way. Before they even get out of town, they're met by white authorities on horseback who shoot tear gas into the crowd, beat Black activists with nightsticks. John Lewis, who just tragically passed away last year, who was a prominent civil rights figure for his entire life, is beaten to within inches of his life. And again, there's the news media showing all of this to all American citizens and to people across the world. So much like the Mississippi burning episode, the Freedom Summer inspired the passage of the the Civil Rights Act of 64. The Selma March inspires the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 65, which finally bans race, sex, sexual orientation as qualifications for voting. So now there's a federal mandate that says, regardless of your state's voting practices, you can't employ Jim Crow laws, which target African Americans and disenfranchise African Americans in the South. Unfortunately, certain political parties will still try to use specific maneuvers to limit the impact of minority votes, mainly through filibusters and changing state laws, which is, as we've all seen recently, still put into play today. The last great legislation of the traditional civil rights movement comes in 68 with the Fair Housing Act. That was very much inspired by the assassination of Martin Luther King. In April of 68, he's in Memphis, Tennessee to support a sanitation workers strike. The focus of the civil rights movement after the Voting Rights Act of 65 shifts to economic agency, providing access to upward social mobility and economic agency to African Americans. MLK supporting a sanitation workers strike when he is assassinated while on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He very famously and sort of prodigiously the night before gives a very famous speech at the Mason Temple Church where he says, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight, we as a people will get to the promised land. I am happy tonight. I am not worried about anything. I am not fearing any man. At 6 p.m. the next day, James Earl Ray shoots Dr. MLK in the neck, killing Martin Luther King Jr., which inspires the last great legislation, the last big legislation of the traditional civil rights movement, the Fair Housing Act of '68. All right, guys. So that is the traditional civil rights movement in sort of one long lecture. And as I said, make sure you guys look over the notes for that and have the notes for that ready for your final exam. All right, guys, I'm out of time. Any questions for me?
No, sir. I think we're good.
All right. Great, guys. Well, thanks a lot. We'll see you guys next week, and we'll talk about Vietnam.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Good
guys. Have a
day.
good one.
Bye.